Happy Memorial Day, everybody. I am recording this at the end of the day, so it's more a reflection on Memorial Day itself and a day that should be both focused on remembrance and resolve. This image is of the President of the United States this morning placing a memorial wreath at the Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington National Cemetery, which is very appropriate, so important, and really becomes kind of the focal point of our national celebration of Memorial Day, and a very appropriate place for us to reflect on the sacrifice of thousands and thousands of men and women who have gone before us in defense of American life and liberty and property. This event normally is followed by a service that takes place here at the Memorial Amphitheater. So this structure was built beginning in 1915. The architects for this structure were Carrere and Hastings, and interesting little connection to Florida there. I'm digressing just a little bit, but Carrere and Hastings actually got their first big break in their 20s. They were young architects, and their first big break came from Henry Flagler, who offered them the opportunity to design and build the Ponce de Leon Hotel in St. Augustine, Florida. This structure comes much later in their career when they're well-established architects. But this was a beautiful contribution to American life. It's used year after year for important events, even up to this day. What you see back behind here, this is where the Tomb of the Unknowns is, on the back side of the amphitheater with the lawn extending down from it. Inside the amphitheater on Memorial Day, the president typically gives an address to the nation and to the guests that are there assembled, and does so from this platform. Many of you, I'm sure, have been there, have been inside, have stood in that very place. When I go with students and families, we always do so. And just below it, you can see just here is this kind of large marble throne-looking chair. And students will often ask me when we're standing there, oh, is that where the president sits? And the answer is no. As you can see, nobody sits there. And that's purposeful. That empty chair is to remind us of those that are not there. So a typical Memorial Day service would look like this, but of course today, because of the reaction to coronavirus, there was none. It looked more like this. And for the first time in its more than 100-year history, there was no Memorial Day service. I do want to point you to some of the silent sentinels that are engraved there on the Memorial Amphitheater. There are many places where there are incredible inscriptions that remind us of what's truly important, what we really celebrate. But I'll direct your attention to 44 inscriptions that surround the external portion of the colonnade. So up here in the frieze, we have these 44 names of battles that had been fought up to that point by American forces. So here you see a Civil War section recording the conflicts at Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg. The very first name that's there in the frieze is Lexington. Lexington's a very different type of battle. The Battle of Lexington wasn't fought by well-equipped, well-armed American soldiers. It was fought by common men, English colonists living here in America who had reached a breaking point, who were standing firm on their rights as Englishmen and ready to defend them to the death. They were grandfathers and grandsons, uncles, nephews, fathers that assembled there on the morning of April 19th, 1775. So I thought about Memorial Day and all of the various conflicts that come to mind. And so many of us think about, our grandparents or great-grandparents and the wars that they served in. My mind drifted all the way back to the very first men who laid down their lives for the cause of American liberty. And it was these average guys, men who drilled on that very ground week after week when church was over, Sunday afternoons, they drilled right there on that town square, that little Lexington Common. And that's where they would be called to stand for their rights. A couple monuments I'll point out. Well, one of them you can't see until I get to another image, but this one, this kind of blocky looking granite monument, is actually a pulpit. It's the reproduction of a pulpit, and it's the place where the pulpit stood at that time. This is where the meeting house was on the town square. As you can see, there were homes that surrounded this little piece of green space. And then just behind this large tree, there's a monument that we'll come back to at the end. But the view that you're seeing is the view that would have been seen by 900 British regulars who had marched out of Boston in the middle of the night, April 18th, 1775, on a secret mission. They were to march out to the little town of Concord, and they'd have to go right through Lexington to get there. What were they doing in Concord? Well, they were sent out to seize munitions, gunpowder, and military supplies that were held in a public armory there. Why might that be? Well, because for 10 years, 1765 to 1775, the British government had gradually really been escalating tensions with their own colonists as they continued to infringe upon their rights as Englishmen. Sometimes petitions would do the trick. People would raise enough of a fuss that the British government would back down and restore some of their rights. But the overarching trend had been towards tyranny. And now, just a few miles away in the town of Boston, to use a term we're all very familiar with these days, the British government had locked them down, literally cut them off from the rest of the world, intending to bring them to their knees through economic persecution, to cut off all of their means of trade and to bring the town of Boston into submission to the British government. They were illegally quartering troops in the town. There were many other violations of the rights of Englishmen. And again, knowing the process, these people had been well trained over the years in the sources of their liberties and how to resist biblically, and they were walking through that process. And so the petitions have been fast and furious throughout this time. And the idea of only offering defensive resistance was also very important to these Massachusetts colonists, as we'll see in just a moment. How was it that they had learned all these things? I'll give you a clue. As those 900 British regulars marched out into the night on this secret mission to seize the stores at Concord, there were other riders who were dispatched to go out and warn the countryside. Among them, of course, famously was Paul Revere. And Paul Revere himself came right through this town, and he went straight to a house that was about 2 blocks off this little town green. He went straight to the house of the pastor, Jonas Clark. Now, Jonas Clark becomes important for a couple of reasons. Okay, so just a couple blocks off the green here is the Clark house. Jonas Clark is the pastor. His pulpit would have been in the place where you just saw that granite monument. Jonas Clark was a patriot, and at this moment he was also housing 2 of the leaders of the Sons of Liberty, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Revere approached this very door. The house stands today. You can visit it. Pounded on the door, waking all the inhabitants to warn them that the British regulars were out and that they had better skedaddle to safer territory lest they be arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to death, because that was indeed the punishment for treason. The backstory, and there was so much drama that night, incredible stories to be told, but one of the stories is that Adams and Hancock don't immediately get out of town, which leads to some, exciting and harrowing moments a few hours later. All that to say, they were housed in the home of Jonas Clark, the pastor of the town. About 100 years later, there's another pastor that comes along and pays tribute to Jonas Clark. And what he has to say, I think, is very important and really fascinating. I won't read it all, I'll just read you a little portion of this. And this is another pastor, again, paying tribute to Reverend Clark. He says, "It can be regarded only as a singularly happy circumstance that, as Lexington was to be the place where resistance to the power of England was first to occur, that the minister of Lexington should have been a man of the principles, character, courage, and energy of Mr. Clark. It can be regarded he was eminently a man produced by the times, more than equal to them, rather a guide and leader. All his previous life, his preaching, his conversation among his people, had been but a continued and most effectual preparation for the noble stand taken by his people on the morning of the 19th of April, 1775. The militia on the common that morning were the same who filled the pews of the meeting house on the Sunday morning before, and the same who hung upon the rear of the retreating enemy in the forenoon and throughout the day. They were only carrying the preaching of many previous years into practice. Did y'all catch that? They were only carrying the preaching of many previous years into practice. What was this man preaching? It would not be beyond the truth to assert that there was no person at that time and in that vicinity, not only no clergyman, but no other person, who took a firmer stand for the liberties of the country or was more ready to perform the duties and endure the sacrifices of a patriot than the minister of Lexington. When the struggle actually commenced, the people were ready for it, thoroughly acquainted with the reasons on which the duty of resistance was founded, and prepared to discharge the duty at every hazard. So what was it that this man was expounding from his pulpit here on Lexington Green? These folks had been taught the doctrines of providence. They'd been taught salvation by grace. They'd been taught the sin nature of man. They'd been taught about the institutions that God had established to function and govern well in society, not just the civil government, but that churches and families and individuals had both the responsibility and the authority to govern well in their God-ordained spheres, that those spheres must be protected, that an expanding civil government was a danger. Those families also had a clear understanding that it was treasonous of them not to protect God's gifts of life and liberty and property. And that in order to do that, you had to hold civil government accountable to the law. But you resisted biblically, and that meant exhaustive petitioning, fleeing when possible, but as a last resort, being willing to risk your life in defensive resistance. And that is what unfolded on the morning of April 19th, 1775. As the British column reached that town common in Lexington, the officer that was at the head of the column was a junior officer, and he made a poor decision. He veered to the right, and as he did so, he brought 2 companies of British soldiers into line. They were going to come upon the gathering Lexington militiamen. Now, again, backstories and all kinds of drama that had occurred through the night, but long story short, the men were regathering. They had actually dispersed, and now they're realizing that the threat is real, it is imminent, and they were regathering. Well, as they regathered, their commander, a veteran of the French and Indian War, a man named Captain John Parker, said to them, "Let the troops pass by. Don't molest them without they being first." Then, as they began to recognize their numbers were, they were at great disadvantage, of course they've been, exhorted to only resist defensively. Now they were ready to actually disperse. So the men began to kind of mumble amongst themselves. Captain Parker overhears them, and to steady his men, he says this: "The first man who offers to run shall be shot down. You need to stand firm. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they want to have a war, let it begin here." Guys, that's a tough call. You're not to fire at them, but you're to stand courageously in your place and not move. You're to be immovable in defending this, your home. And if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. Well, the next thing that began to unfold, again, this junior officer brings these 2 companies of British regulars out onto the green, and they immediately go from a column formation into line of battle. So there's all kinds of hurry and scurry as they reform into these 3 horizontal lines with loaded muskets, now taking aim at these colonists. The senior officer, Major John Pitcairn, sees what's unfolding, charges to the front, tries to kind of get control of this situation. He'll be too late. Because in that moment, as he's ordering the colonial militia to disperse, lay down your arms, you rebels, disperse, Captain John Parker sees that that's probably the best solution in this moment as well, because of the chaos, and he orders his men to disperse. And at that very moment, a shot is fired. To this day, we know not which side fired that shot. There were intense investigations after the fact, and people, we believe, really gave their best testimony, but it was never discovered where that shot came from. But what happened immediately after that single shot was that the British regulars took that as a signal to fire. And so a volley rang out there on Lexington Common, hundreds of musket balls flying through the air. And in an instant, 7 of the colonial militia were dead there on Lexington Common. And again, you guys, you can see from this sketch, which was made at the time, this is the meeting house here. Right here's the meeting. This is the church. This is the road that leads out from Boston. Here they're approaching the fork in the road, and these guys go to the right. There are homes that are directly adjacent to the common. There are people hanging out of their windows watching this unfold. 7 men dead immediately. Guys, everybody knew somebody that was out there. They were related to people that were out there. Everybody lost somebody in that initial conflict. An 8th man, Jonathan Harrington, struggled from the field, and his home literally butted right up to the common. So he crawled to his home, collapsing on the front doorsteps in the arms of his wife. Jonathan Harrington died right there on the steps of his home in the presence of his wife and his son. In the years to come, the remains of these men who died that day would be reinterred back there on Lexington Green, right in the place where they fell, and a monument was erected to their memory. I want to read to you from that monument. Their remains are buried at the base of the monument, and the panel reads as follows: "Sacred to liberty and the rights of mankind, the freedom and independence of America, sealed and defended with the blood of her sons. This monument is erected by the inhabitants of Lexington under the patronage and the expense of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to the memory of their fellow citizens, Ensign Robert Monroe, Misters Jonas Parker, Samuel Hadley, Jonathan Harrington, Isaac Muzzy, Caleb Harrington, and John Brown of Lexington, and Ishael Porter of Woburn, who fell on this field, the first victims to the sword of British tyranny and oppression, on the morning of the ever memorable 19th of April, Anno Domini 1775. It goes on to read, "The die was cast. The blood of these martyrs in the cause of God and their country was the cement of the union of these states, then colonies, and gave the spring to the spirit, firmness, and resolution of their fellow citizens. They rose as one man to revenge their brethren's blood, and at the point of the sword to assert and defend their native rights. They nobly dared to be free. The contest was long, bloody, and affecting. Righteous heaven approved the solemn appeal. Victory crowned their arms, and the peace, liberty, and independence of the United States of America was their glorious reward." And that is the reward that you and I still enjoy today. But do you see that when you're standing there at that monument, it's not just a place of remembrance of the lives and the sacrifice of those men. They are telling you that what happened there became the resolve. It stiffened the resolve of their countrymen. It gave the spring to the spirit, firmness, and resolution of their fellow citizens, who then rose and defended American liberties. That's what it should do today. We don't just remember, we resolve. And that brings us back to this memorial amphitheater at Arlington National Cemetery. There above the platform where the president addresses the nation every year, in the apse, that arch above the apse, I'm going to zoom in so you can see, but right here, these words are inscribed. "We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain." We remember and we resolve. Now, those words should sound familiar to you because they're the words of Abraham Lincoln in his Gettysburg Address. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. And much like what happened at Lexington, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. That is my hope on Memorial Day. Let us both remember the sacrifice of so many, beginning at Lexington, who defended life, liberty, and property, and resolve that they shall not have died in vain. Let us resolve to understand the sources of liberty as they did and defend it for generations to come. Happy Memorial Day.